Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be continuing some of the advanced PXM development concepts. We'll be looking at InDesign variables and how these are important for automated publications. We'll be understanding running headers, custom text, and how PXM can write to and create InDesign variables on the fly. So once again, we're going back to our source document. Now, the amusing thing is you'll notice that here there's a designer note that says update table of contents. And this is something that is obviously put in a very loud color so that anytime new contents are created, somebody has to go through and manually update this. And this is a reminder to them to do that. Well, I like that this is here because it really underscores the fact that PXM automates this portion completely and we'll no longer need to have that note for the designers. Anytime you're opening that document in that book that we just made, as new content is added, it will automatically appear within that document. So once we have that out of the way, a few things to point out here. So first off, we're going to look at our table of contents itself, and it's basically got a few things. It has a style, a paragraph style here called TOC chapter, and if we go and take a look at that, what it utilizes is something known as substyles. And so if we look at the substyles within that, and that is a nested style there, you can see that we have these nested styles that occur through X number of words, and we can see this at the beginning here. And so basically we're saying, okay, we have a nested style that is going to give us a particular color for this, and then another style that's giving us the color for the pipeline, and then another style that's giving us the color for the eventual text. And this order is quite important because it'll reflect how we do our implementation for the table of contents. We're going to be having a variable that will update this value, and then we have some spacing, and then we have a pipeline if we want to do that, and then we have the text itself, and this text is going to be the article name, and that's going to also be updated dynamically as well. And so this is how we're going to build the table of contents. And then there's also a step later on in the document. So as we're building the document itself, when we get to the articles and we build this article on the page, we're going to need to update the table of content. And so it's going to say, right, this article is page, whatever, as that's being updated. So there are really two parts to this variable definition. We will be defining the variable and defining what gets updated, and then we'll be updating the variable as we go through the document, and the variable will be updated with the page number that article is on. And so those are the two halves to the actual table of contents implementation. And the nice thing is that PXM allows you to, and has a mechanism for updating that value later on in the document. Things don't necessarily need to flow that linearly. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the concept of variables in general in InDesign. And one of the great things that they've done nonlinear when they were doing this initial design is that as we go through the document, you can see here that they have this running header, and they implement that by using the chapter name, and that is a running header style. And what it basically means is whatever is on or using the style H1 on a page, that then becomes the running header, and it updates a variable, and that variable is in turn used in the master document that puts that value on the page. So if we go to our master document here and we look at our inside pages, you can see here that we've used that variable running header, and that's that chapter name there. And that running header variable again is simply taking the style and header one. And so in our case, we don't have to do anything particularly difficult or interesting. This running header is actually handled by the master document in its entirety. But the point is really to point that out so that sometimes you need to update or have hidden styles. So for example, let's say we had a month on a page and we never had that in a title. You would still have that as the style, but that style would be hidden, and that's a fairly common PXM implementation. So that's the one type of variable that is commonly used. The next type is custom text, and it's simply the ability to set and use custom text. Now here in our master document, we don't see any other additional variables, but that is what PXM will be doing, is we'll be setting custom text variables and updating custom text variables and actually using those and inserting those into the page to build this table of contents. Now we have a couple renderers that we'll be using. We'll be using a renderer to insert the variable into our PXM project XML stream, and that same renderer will update those variables later on. And then we have another renderer that we'll be using to actually insert the text for that article title into our table of contents as well. And why do we have, or why do we need a new custom renderer to do that? Well, it's because all the custom renderers that we have already, or the default renderers, already provide a lot of wrapping. They either do things like putting text frame around your text or putting a paragraph style around your text. We don't want to have that shown. We want to actually be able to just insert text into an existing paragraph style. And so that's why we're doing that running header. And so you can see here in this case, you know, the text frame has a whole bunch of wrapper information around it. And then there's also a paragraph style there. And then we get to our text. And so we need to make a new variable to just insert text somewhere into this stream exactly where we want it. And why is that really important here? Well, because our existing paragraph style renderer renders text up front, and we don't want to render text up front. We want to render our variable placement up front and then put in a bunch of placeholder text and then put in our text on the page. And so that's why we need to have two new renderers to do that. So as before, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. I'm going to create those renderers. I'm going to build my project. I'm going to add those renderers as something that can be used in Sitecore. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, skip to the end, show you what was built, and then we'll get to how to actually use those items in our PXM project. Okay, so we're back in Visual Studio here. I just want to show you very quickly what we've added. We've got three new classes, and we're really making two renderers. One is an inherited class XML content renderer here, which the dynamic content renderer uses, as well as the TOC index renderer. And the dynamic content renderer basically allows you to take parameters in the exact same way that a text frame renderer or any other renderer does. So you've got data keys, fields, etc., etc. The big difference is that this will render within an XML stream. It won't render a paragraph style along with it. It won't render a text frame along with it. And this is really useful for when we're building up strings essentially within our XML. And so that's the purpose of the dynamic content renderer. The table of contents also uses the dynamic content renderer in a way, but what it also does is basically allowing you to do some dictionary swapping. So if we look at our definition of those renderers here in the templates, we have a variable definition which will insert this XML, and we're using some XML content, which is why we have that content renderer inherited. And then we're replacing the table of contents index value here. And what this is doing is it's basically incrementing and replacing variables. So when we see this XML inserted into our XML stream, we're going to see table of contents value 1, table of contents value 2, etc., etc. And so this is the format for inserting that variable and defining that on the page and how that's used. And we actually have sort of a sister template to go along with that. And this is a hidden variable, and it uses this format. Instead of TOC, it uses TTOC. And these are basically reserved names for PXM, and it will automatically do swapping of those variables and define that variable value. So This will be in our upfront definition, the TOC variable definition, and that will output the eventual number on the page that we see here in our document. And then we will place a copy of this variable updating later on in our document when we're actually rendering out the article. And what it will do is basically say, oh, take my current page number and update that variable and pass that back to the TOC variable definition. So we have one renderer, which is the variable renderer, but we're using two sets of standard values. One which creates the variable and uses TOC index to create that and place that on the page, and another which uses, again, same renderer but different standard values to use a slightly different format, TTOC. So it's a table of contents updater, essentially. And so that's what we're using for our table of contents. And then our dynamic content is using the dynamic content renderer, and it has a whole bunch of information for grabbing data keys and grabbing item fields and field references. So we can use that to basically place the chapter title within that XML stream. So we're going to use a combination of that table of contents variable creator to build up this, and we can even insert some of the spacing and pipelines and other fun stuff if we want to. And then we're going to use the dynamic content template and the value from that, and we'll say, hey, go and get that current article title and put that in there. So we'll use a combination of that code that we created, those custom renderers, as well as the templates that we've defined to both set and retrieve those updated variable values. So we're going to go back to our document and take a little bit of a look at the text that we have and that we're working with. You'll see here, this is right now static text, and it's referencing all the content that we got from Nonlinear. These are their page numbers and their article titles, but you can see that we do have chapter headings within that. So we have some introduction and some other information. We won't have that in ours, but we do have chapter headings and then articles within that chapter heading. So we actually want to make our table of contents reasonably complex. We want to see chapter headings there as well. And so we need to do some of what we did with the repeaters again. We're going to need those chapter repeaters. So we're basically going to say, hey, go iterate through my chapters, get the title, iterate through the articles within the chapter, get each of those article headlines. And so we're going to basically replicate a lot of that structure that we saw in our body content. We're doing that in the table of contents as well. So we're going to go back to our document, and I've also taken the liberty to update a few of the fields here. We have our body field and we have our title field. I'm going to take the title and move it up. I'm going to take the body and delete that static text. I'm keeping the static text here for the table of contents because we don't actually have an item in Sitecore called table of contents. So there's no CMS managed content that we can use, unlike everything else, like for the chapters and for the article titles. So I'm going to leave that static text there. You can see that static text item and basically has paragraph style and the C data and table of contents here. The only thing I've done is made this capitalized because that's really the format that we're using for the rest of the document, unlike Nonlinear where they're doing a lot of things in lowercase. So that's the first thing that we're doing. And the second thing that we're doing is we're going to start to build on some of this body. Now, what we're going to do is use a lot of these repeaters that we saw in the chapters and the articles. And so I'm going to take this and I'm going to say copy and copy to, and this will bring up a dialog that will allow me to copy that to somewhere else within the content tree. I want to copy that chapters repeater underneath my body here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to strip out a lot of the stuff that we're seeing for those pages. I don't need pages, so we'll go and remove those. And similarly within my article, I also don't need pages, so I'm going to remove those as well. But what I do want to have is basically those repeaters with those data keys as necessary. Now what I do want to have under the chapter is I do want to have a snippet, and the snippet will allow me to receive that chapter data key. So I'm going to go and I'm going to insert that. And I could also just go and make a copy of one of my snippets here. And the reason is that has my data key as well. So I could make a new one, or I can copy this one. I'm going to make a copy of this one and say copy to my TOC body chapters here. So I've now got that snippet, and I have a text frame underneath that. I'm going to remove that. I don't need a text frame, but I do want to have this chapter here. So within this now, I'm going to insert a new paragraph style, and I call this chapter title. And the chapter title, what does it use? It just uses the title field. So at this point here, I could go up and look at the XML viewer and see what I'm outputting. So great, this is saying I've got my paragraph style this chapter, I've got my paragraph style this chapter. Excellent, excellent. So the text frame that wraps this all is coming from the body element, and then within that text frame I have my paragraph styles that correctly retrieve my chapter title that is coming from my repeater. So that's done. That's exactly what I want. Now for my article, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go down and go to my article repeater, and I'm going to copy that to my article item within my table of contents. And I'm doing that again just because this affords me having the proper renderer set and also the proper data key. But I'm going to go and delete all those sub items. So now that I have that article created, I'm going to again create a new paragraph style that is going to be called article listing. And then within this, I'm going to insert my table of contents variable definition. And then also going to insert a dynamic content renderer for the article title. And I'm going to move that down. Again, the order is really important. The article title is simply the title field. And for my variable definition here, I'm going to do something a little bit useful. I'm going to copy some text here. Special character 9 and this pipeline and a couple spaces. And special character 9 is basically essentially like a tab within InDesign. So if we now go back to our snippet here for the TOC listing and launch the XML viewer, you can see that we're rendering our table of contents. That's that static text there. And then if we go down in our text frame here, which is our body text frame, we're rendering out a chapter title. And then after that, we're creating another paragraph style that has the variable for what the page number is, and then a special character, and then some spaces, and then our title. And so all of this is coming in another paragraph style. And so each chapter, you can see here, chapter 1 has 2 following paragraphs: table of contents 0, table of contents 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., etc. These values are blank because they will be updated by our variable updater that we will insert into the chapters as they're being output onto the page. But we want to make sure here that our initial insert variable definition is set here in our code, as well as the order being very important. So we want our variable, which is the number that will be updated first, and then a tab, and then our pipeline, and then some spacing, and then our text. And that order is very important because the order from the document itself, as far as the style, is expecting that exact order. So we're trying to replicate that as closely as possible. So let's now go down to our chapter and update the, or insert, I should say, the XML code in order to update the variables. So what we're going to do here is on our article snippet, I'm going to manually insert a new text frame, And so I'll go to the publishing engine and select text frame, and I will call that hidden text frame and put that in. And I need to give that some values. It does have to have some X and Y, and actually you can see here that it has put in some placeholders. I'm going to move that to the very top so that we know what that's purpose is. And then within that, I'm going to use my paragraph style renderer. And again, this is because every text frame needs to have a paragraph style. It is absolutely mandatory. And then within that, I'm going to add a new variable for TOC variable updating. And you can see it's already put in some variables for me for the content itself and for my article index to do the swapping on that. So at this point now, what will happen is a hidden text frame will get rendered, and then within that it will update variables. So if I look at my XML viewer view and render that out, we're going to see here that I now have a new paragraph style, which in turn is in that text frame that I created and contains that variable which is hidden, but then using this format of TTOC, it's basically taking that page variable and passing it to our initial variable. Now we're not actually seeing what page is generated here, and the reason is because that's all handled by PXM within the InDesign client. And so as it's building that document, it's basically using this as a trigger to then say, oh, this is page 5, send page 5 to that variable. And so because we don't know what's being generated on the client really until it's generated on the client, it's actually the InDesign, the PXM plugin within InDesign that's handling that variable and doing that updating. We're just really defining the references of where the variable is being used on the page and where we're updating that variable, and the actual value that's being passed is being handled by PXM. So at this point now we can go back to InDesign and look at the table of contents that has been generated. So we'll go back to InDesign. We'll once again refresh our project. This will basically show that we're capturing all that new information from the project, and that's what we're going to load. And we're going to load that launch Sitecore book. So again, takes about 20 seconds or so, but it is building a fairly complex document. And let's look. So great, we have the content that we want. Our page numbers are updated correctly based upon those variables. Now what we don't have though is all the paragraph styles set correctly, and this is really because we are creating those items in Sitecore. So we'll go and see and say, okay, callout looks good for that. We'll make sure that our TOC chapter looks good. That's exactly what we want to see. So we're going to select some of this stuff manually just to make sure that looks good, but then we'll go back into our Sitecore item and update that and make sure that that's correctly set. So that's basically it for variables. As well as if you look at text variables and look at the definition, you can see that all of this was created and coming by PXM and updated on the fly. So you can actually see what those values are and see them being updated. And so that's pretty clever as well. So you can see that in use. So that's really it. That's how you do variable updating and how you use variables within your InDesign document, and everything else is really just going back to our PXM items here and updating the appropriate styles so that we can actually use these styles here. Now one thing that we're seeing here, so for chapter title, the style is a drop down. PXM includes a styles library essentially. So if we look here in our styles, we have a number of basically placeholders for adding new styles. So I'm going to make a new paragraph style here, and I'm going to call that callout, and be aware of case sensitivity. So I'm going to say callout, and this does allow you to do some swapping of styles from PXM and from your Sitecore document to InDesign, but I'm just going to leave that as is. But that means if I do go back to my chapter title here, I now have callout as a drop down. So I can select and use that. And then that means the next time I load this document, and I can do that just by closing this, refreshing to ensure that that text change came along, and load, you'll see that that callout style is used. And so you would do the same for the actual article title listing as well, and similarly any other formatting that you need to do. So we can see callout is now being used there. So again, I'm not going to go and do every single tiny little text change that's necessary, because there are a few here that I need to do as well to make this text look good by changing those values, but I'm going to go ahead and add those. And the important thing is just that you understand the core concepts behind table of contents creation and updating in PXM. Similarly, it's also true we need to turn this document into a flow as well, because the table of contents can flow on a number of pages. So this document basically is functionally complete aside from visual and aesthetic changes and flows that need to be set. In the version that you can download from GitHub, all of that will be in place. And so we're not focusing 100% in these videos on totally getting everything right, but we're just basically focusing on the core concepts and trying not to rehash a lot of those tasks that you're going to have to do over and over again.